Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Beloved people of God, grace to you and peace in Jesus' name. And I tell you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. It's one of the great, memorable lines in Matthew's Gospel. It's such a strong, powerful statement from Jesus about Peter, about the church, and as such, it's been beloved by the church, or at least the institution of the church, for millennia. I think it's fair to say that it's been especially beloved by our Roman Catholic siblings, who have a special affinity for Peter as the leader of the apostles, this first among equals, who was both an actual leader in the early church and also a symbol of a kind of continuity of leadership as the centuries went by. So it's no mystery why it's said that the Pope occupies the chair of St. Peter, and why it's St. Peter's Basilica that stands at the center of the Vatican, a place of pilgrimage for Christians from all over the world. Perhaps it's also not surprising that it's these very words from Matthew's Gospel that are etched in stone around the base of the enormous dome that crowns St. Peter's Basilica. The words are in Latin, "Tu es Petrus, et super hunc Petrum edificabo ecclesiam." You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. It's a fun play on words that in both the original Greek and in Latin, Peter's name, which is Petrus or Petros, literally means rock. It's as if Jesus is calling him Rocky, the rock upon which he will build his church. And the charge to Peter seems to get even more intense with the words of Jesus that follow. Not even the gates of Hades will be able to prevail against this church, founded on the rock. And even more, Jesus appears to be talking to Peter when he says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And by the way, those words are also printed in great, huge letters around the base of that dome in St. Peter's. Of course, our Lutheran Protestant tradition has had a little different take on all of this. Rather than emphasizing the physical person of Peter and the line of leaders that has followed him, Lutherans have been more likely to say that the rock Jesus is referring to here is not Peter himself, but to the witness that he made. Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" To that question, Peter had just answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Protestants are more likely to say that it's that confession of faith, that witness to Jesus, that is the rock upon which Christ builds his church. And I have to say, as a maybe rather biased Lutheran preacher, I think this interpretation is only strengthened when we consider how often Peter is remembered in the Gospels as less than faithful, as the one who jumps out of the boat, only to sink like a rock until Jesus catches him and pulls him back, as the one to whom Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," as the one who, on a fateful night, denies Jesus, not just once, but 3 times. Insofar as Peter confesses the truth, insofar as he stands with Jesus and is a vessel of God's truth and grace, then he is a rock. But insofar as he fails Jesus' mission and his mission of love and grace, then he is no great rock of faith, but rather more like a stumbling stone. I'd say the same holds true for the church as a whole, and for us. We can be and are both living stones of faith and love, and stumbling stones, hindrances to the kingdom of love Christ would build among us. We are both. As Martin Luther famously wrote, we are simultaneously sinners and saints. Paradoxically, we can be and are both. And at their best, all churches and followers of Christ know this profound truth. And I think that at their best, all churches and followers of Christ are also keen to acknowledge this, that when it comes to this particular image of the church, the only true rock is Christ. As the Apostle Paul writes, we followers of Christ are the ones who need to be transformed always and ever again into the mind and image of Christ. The cornerstone of the church is always and only the one who is incarnate love itself. The great rock of the church is Christ, not us. But here, I'd like to keep playing with this image of rock and stone. Last Sunday, in her sermon on the steps for the children, Pastor Miriam tried to get us all to understand that multiple and even very different images of God can be true at the same time. Pastor Miriam talked about God as a rock, and she talked about how that image is true, because there's a way in which God is unchangeable, a firm foundation which can never be moved. But then she also held up a rubber band and said that God is like this too. Like Jesus, who was challenged and changed by the Syrophoenician woman in last Sunday's gospel reading. Rather than being set in stone, Scripture is clear that God's love can and does stretch and expand, even so far as to embrace those we could have never imagined being included. This is also true. But back to this image of God as an eternal, unchanging rock. I was struck in how, in the reading from Isaiah that Sharon read for us this morning, there are really 2 powerful images there. The first is that of a rock quarry, where the prophet tells the people to look to the rock from which you were hewn and to the quarry from which you were dug. The prophet refers to Abraham and Sarah, these great ancestors in the faith. But I don't think it's too crazy of an interpretive jump to also read that rock quarry as a symbol of the people's inheritance in their God. Many places in the Hebrew Scriptures, God is referred to as a rock, the solid place upon which the people stand. But then, all of a sudden in that reading from Isaiah, the image shifts and we hear, "For the Lord will comfort Zion, comfort all its waste places, and will make its wilderness like Eden, its desert like the garden of the Lord." Now, it might take just a little imaginative work to follow what I'm going to say next. But consider with me here that the prophet was writing to exiles, people for whom their beloved city, Jerusalem, had been laid in ruins. And so when the prophet talks about waste places, the image really is of piles of stones. That's what an ancient city would have looked like when it was laid in ruins. And from that, then, the image shifts so quickly to that of a garden. In the sweep of this passage, the dry, rocky wilderness of a ruined city becomes the fertile, life-giving green of the Garden of Eden. Now maybe I'm playing a little bit too much with these images and taking them a bit far, but I can't help but think of the connection between these two things, a rocky wasteland and a fertile garden. If you would, think geologically with me for a moment. All the earth started as a rocky wasteland. When our planet was born, that's all the earth there was. If you want a mental image of it, think of a newly created volcanic island, or maybe the piles of rubble that are left after a glacier retreats. There's no life there at all. Until some crazy creatures like lichen start eating away at the minerals in the rock. And then eventually there are enough crevices, enough flaked off mineral soil for some pioneering plants to gain a foothold. And eventually, after who knows how many thousands of years, as those plants die and as new ones grow, this thing called soil, humus, it forms. And eventually, after millennia of these cycles of life and death, there is what is needed for the kind of paradise we call a garden. Barren rock has turned to soil, and Eden blooms. The wasteland has been transformed into a garden. I've always loved that in the Gospel of John, death and resurrection happen in a garden. Toward the end of the Gospel, there's this line that always takes my breath away. John writes, "Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified. And in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid, and so they laid Jesus there." I think those lines are both shocking and incredibly beautiful, all at the same time. There was a garden in this wasteland place of crucifixion and death. It's really kind of a preposterous statement, but it's also full of such gospel beauty and truth, isn't it? Eden is blooming right here in this place of death. And it's blooming because of Christ's own death, because of this gift of divine compassion, this gift of infinite grace and love for this broken, dying world. There, in the wasteland of Golgotha, the wasteland we've created, Eden is blooming and resurrection dawns. I do think there's a powerful image here of Christ, the rock, who is on the cross, worn down and crushed, turned into soil, this matrix of death and life, where Eden can bloom, and we, broken, dying creatures, can know life and hope and joy once again. Dear friends, Christ is the eternal, unchanging one, more solid even than the most ancient stone. Christ is also the unimaginably tender, humble, broken one, who with compassion unending holds us in love and leads us in this way of death and life, of love without end. This is the solid rock on which we stand. In Jesus' name.